Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our book event with Nubar Hovsepian on Edward Said, The Politics of an Oppositional Intellectual. Before we begin, just a few announcements about events that might be of interest to the audience. Tomorrow, there's going to be a screening and discussion of the film Boycott at 6 p.m. in the afternoon in the CCAS boardroom. Food will be provided. And next week, on Tuesday, March the 24th at 3:30, there's going to be a Georgetown faculty teaching on the U.S.-Israel war on Iran in the Laureate Auditorium at 3:30. Posters and more information on those events are available both online and outside this room. So it's a huge honor to host Nubar Hovsepian at Georgetown, especially to celebrate the publication of his new intellectual biography on Edward Said. Nubar Hovsepian is an associate professor emeritus of political science at Chapman College in Orange, California. He's the author of the new book, Edward Said, Politics of an Oppositional Intellectual, as well as Palestinian State Formation, Education, and the Construction of National Identity. He has authored and edited many books, numerous articles and essays over his illustrious career. Nubar was also a newspaper columnist in Arabic covering the Iranian Revolution and the politics of the global South. He spent his entire life as both an intellectual and activist on the question of Palestine and the broader politics of the Arab and Islamic world. His new book on Edward Said is a true intellectual tour de force. Now, as all of you know or should know, Edward Said was one of the most important and influential scholars and intellectuals in the latter half of the 20th century. He made enduring contributions to the field of literary theory and criticism, comparative literature, post-colonial studies, intellectual history, music criticism, and especially on the politics and ethics of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Much has been written over the years about Edward Said's impact and influence since he died in 2003. Nubar breaks new ground and brilliantly synthesizes Edward Said's life and enduring legacy in his new intellectual biography. Writing about his new book, Sarah Roy from Harvard, who will be here next week, writes the following. Nubar Hovsepian provides us with a novel and truly compelling way of understanding Said's thinking over time that could only have come from someone with a long and close personal friendship with Said. Hovsepian reveals his extraordinary command of Said's entire corpus of writings, which he examines in a manner that is both erudite and lucid. What emerges is a scholarly yet intimate but not uncritical study of Said's life of mind that speaks not only to Said's brilliance, but also to his humanity and his unyielding morality. Please join me in welcoming Nubar Hovsepian.
My visit to Washington, D.C. has proven to be kind of more of a homecoming to see old and young friends. And so I appreciate that immensely. Some are not able to be here, but I'll go visit them at their home because they're not too well right now. So I appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate Nader's words. He early on listened to the first podcast I did on the book, which is an interview with David Barsamian. I'd like to just raise a few points to give you a feeling for what this work is about. Right? Edward's least commented upon book is my favorite, and also least reviewed, After the Last Sky. After the Last Sky was a photo essay with Jean Moore, the Swiss photographer, who worked so well with John Berger's series of books. Right? I remember we were sitting in a cafe or in a restaurant with Berger, with Jean Moore and Edward and Shafir Hout, talking about putting an exhibit together at the UN of photos. So Jean agreed to do that, and then later he agreed to go to New York with 2 suitcases of photographs to produce After the Last Sky. There are two essays. Edward's essay, interwoven with an incredible set of black and white images. After the Last Sky reminds me of the tragedies that Palestinians encounter. It is, where should we go after the last frontier? Where should the birds fly after the last sky? These are the words of Mahmoud Darwish that adorn the beginning of Said's book. Well, we are in the same situation. What I would like to do is just, in view of Edward's participation in this project, and of course the UN never failed to disappoint us. The photo exhibit was put on, but they decided it would be better without captions. So Palestinians remained nameless and placeless in the UN that's supposedly pro-Palestinian. So Edward writes in this book, and I just will take it from it, the stability of geography and the continuity of land, these have completely disappeared from my life and the life of all Palestinians. If we are not stopped at borders or herded into camps or denied re-entry and residence or barred from travel from one place to another, more of our land is taken. Our lives are interfered with arbitrarily. Our voices are prevented from reaching each other. Our identity is confined to frightened little islands in an inhospitable environment of superior military force, sanitized by the clinical jargon of pure administration. We confront several Zionist master plans, annexation, expropriation, continuity for them, the dominant population, discontinuity for us, the dispossessed and the dispersed. I think if you haven't read Said, I would recommend you start with that. And the second book you should start with is a short book that was a series of interviews done by Aram, I don't remember his last name, an Armenian, Kusilian, in a book titled Parallels and Paradoxes. It's an interview between Edward Said and why am I forgetting his name? The Israeli conductor that he worked with, Daniel Barenboim and Daniel Barenboim. That would be a wonderful kind of introduction to the ideas and to the musicality of those ideas, if you would. Right. So let me suggest a few things here. Now, my book is premised on a simple formula. How does humanism inform Said's politics? To do that, I decided, well, what type of, how do we look at the role of intellectuals? The term public doesn't appeal to me because they're a dime a dozen, right? Sam Huntington is a public intellectual, right? But he was a warmonger, right? So what I decided is to adopt a framework of an oppositional intellectual to power, right? And the oppositional intellectuals function is to create communities of resistance and to speak not truth to power, the Quaker thought, but to inform people so that they can confront authority and power, right? So the oppositional intellectual is what I dub Said. And he becomes the oppositional intellectual precisely by looking at the role of his interlocutors, right? He wrote a book on intellectuals. I don't think that's a good start. You know, it's one of his weakest books, I think, right? It's a series of BBC lectures, right? Unedited, undeveloped, and all that, right? Some might take exception to my commenting on that. What informed his understanding of the oppositional intellectual are two people, in fact. Both of them were dear friends of his. One was Iqbal Ahmad, and Iqbal introduced him to the notion of resistance against colonial domination and imperialism. Right? But also Iqbal taught him something very crucial, that being militant does not necessarily mean militarism. Right? And therefore, for him, resistance and its primary objective is to weaken the resolve of the adversary. Now, that's a high standard, right? Because a lot of the things that Palestinians have done have probably created the obverse of that, or the opposite of that. So that's one. And the other one who kind of brought Edward into the Palestinian political world is Ibrahim Abu Lughod. These are the two people that I think will inform us of his oppositional intellectual nature, rather than, others that he discusses in his book on it's a nice book to read, actually, but it doesn't tell you about his politics, right? So the oppositional intellectual then is committed to liberty and humanism that is required and that requires crossing boundaries. I juxtapose that because the book deals with a lot of people who try to kind of not only critique, but try to take Edward down a few notches. They just failed. They couldn't bring him down a few notches. Right? So the categories I juxtapose Edward with is the native informant as one. The term native informant is, I think, produced by William Baker in his book on Sadat and after, right? And the native informant are essentially the natives who can say the things that white folks can't say about the natives. I mean, to put it in crass terms. Here in mind, I have people like Kanaan Makiya. Now, he's kind of forgotten in history, right? He served a purpose during a war. And I remember I invited him on the eve of the war to speak to my class at Hunter College. And I asked him at the end of his talk, do you have any reservations about your people to get killed? He said no. That ended whatever friendship we had at that moment. Fuad Ajami. Well, Fuad Ajami decided that the best thing to do is to become pro-imperialist, pro-Israeli, etc. Right? And the media dubbed him as a sage, right? And V.S. Naipaul, the man who hated the brown man being a brown man himself, right? So the native informants then are people who serve power very well. They serve the interests of the colonial powers. Now, the third category, the servants of power, they're a dime a dozen. From Huntington to Bernard Lewis, or a Christopher Hitchens in his neocon days, right? Because Christopher Hitchens was a lefty, right? On the 50th anniversary of Edward's birthday, Hitchens and I sat next to each other at his table in the dining room, at Edward's dining room. Well, and Edward didn't critique him for a long time because he liked him as a friend. Well, he abandoned that. So the servants of power are a dime a dozen, but they do a function, right? They support war. They rationalize wars. They rationalize American foreign policy and all that. The last, and I think the more interesting category, is what Michael Walter calls the connected, centered, or the fence-sitter. So for him, Camus is the connected, centered fence-sitter. But Camus in Algeria does not see the natives. Unlike Sartre and de Beauvoir, he sits on the fence. There is no Arab that appears in L'Étranger, right? It takes until 2013 when an Algerian writer by the name of Kamel Dawood writes the Meursault investigation. in which the Algerian appears in their own story. Right? So that this type of intellectual then sits on the fence. But how can you sit on the fence when you have genocide going on? You can't, right? So, in view of this, Edward then decides that he has a job to do. Right? He was reluctant to appear in public. In fact, the first time I saw him in public, I had just come from Beirut from a trip in 1975. The airport closed down in Beirut, and I was in Chicago attending the AAUG conference, the Arab American University Graduates Conference. And Edward was the host of the evening program. He was mumbling, he was inarticulate, but within a few years, the articulate Saeed would appear. And that became the public persona that people knew. Now, let me think of two things. I just want to take a couple of comments on some of his writings, but then move on the question of Palestine, because that is probably something that is of concern to us in view of ongoing genocide in Gaza and elsewhere, and ethnic cleansing happening all the time. Now, Edward's work, both in Orientalism and cultural imperialism, has been commented upon, reviewed, critiqued incredibly. I think part of my problem with the reviews that these books have received is they see them as disjointed rather than an oeuvre, right? I mean, imagine if you only read the Communist Manifesto and you say you know Marx. I mean, bullshit, excuse my French. You have to read the Grundrisse at least to see how he plans to write Capital, and maybe the poverty of theory and the German ideology, and if anti-Düring, a few other things like that. So you need to read Said's oeuvre, and he builds it. There are a lot of things missing in Orientalism, and cultural imperialism provides him with the opportunity to establish an understanding of resistance. He focuses a lot on different writers from the Third World. He focuses a lot on Fanon. I think he shortchanges Cabral, who I think Cabral is probably the most important theorist coming out of the Third World, especially his essay, The Weapon of Theory, right? And Cabral, very much like Iqbal, always warned, make sure that we divide the forces of the enemy rather than uniting them. Treat them well, the prisoners, the Portuguese prisoners, because they will be our future ambassadors in Portugal. Right? Cabral had foresight, coming from a small little country, Guinea-Bissau, but he was the most important theorist of the African revolution. So with these works, Said has situated himself now and has moved to deal with Palestine. But even before these works, in 1979, he publishes The Question of Palestine. It's an uneven book, right? The last chapter probably needs a lot of rewriting. The chapter that is the most valuable, that has produced much subsequent development, is chapter 2, Zionism from the standpoint of its victims. Right? So that when you look at that type of work and all the work that has looked at Zionism in connection to apartheid and all that, that's the pioneering work. And probably earlier on, Maxime Rodinson does something similar in his work. The question of Palestine is interesting as a book, right? It was not published in Arabic. Now, the reason for that is interesting, right? I just saw, I just attended the burial of Walid Khalidi up at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Watertown, actually. And he was my professor in 1972 at AUB. I respected him a lot, but he actually wrote, and I have this because I mined the archives, Edward's archives, a 3-page memo telling Edward all the things he has to change about the manuscript. And of course, Edward told him to go fly a kite. Probably a bit less polite than that. And the reason for that is Edward always viewed Palestine from a standpoint that is different than Arab nationalist perspective. Arab nationalist perspective did not acknowledge any Jewish claims in Palestine. Edward does. But then he follows it saying, but it is imperative that our displacement is something they caused, and therefore we cannot have them have those rights at our expense. Right? So the question of Palestine is valuable in that sense, and it opens up a series of attempts to deal with the non-Palestinian other, right? But all of the Jewish respondents critiqued the book as if he had nothing positive to offer. Walter Laqueur was probably the worst in his review, and there is some schmuck who was writing in some horrible newspaper, and then he ended up being a settler. I don't even remember his name, who also wrote about Said being not Palestinian and not really from Palestine. I don't remember his name, but an incredibly low-class character. So the book itself shows Said that a non-articulate political stance. In the same book, he supports a democratic secular state, a possible two-state, and possibly yet a third variation. So Edward is not a systematic political thinker, but he never claimed to be, right? What he is, he gives a certain moral depth to the Palestine cause, right? And that moral depth is what keeps him, what people appreciated. As an aside, just to explain his moral depth, when he went to Birzeit to receive an honorary doctorate, Islamic students wanted to meet with him. So I happened to be there, so I happened to go with him to meet with them. And they told him one thing: Doctor, we disagree with you on many things, but we respect you because you speak the truth. It is that moral standing that Edward acquired over the years, that others do not. I mean, today Rashid has that presence, if you will, among Palestinians, but not many others. So the question of Palestine remained open to multiple possibilities, but the one thing he never gave up on, he said, in the long run, it is the politics of inclusion that will determine an outcome in Palestine, and not one that excludes anyone, Palestinians or otherwise. Now, Edward moves away from that, and he adopts a two-state solution because that was the norm going. And he was, at that time, probably less critical of the Palestinian leadership than he should have been. But he and most Palestinian intellectuals were rather, shall we say, they tried not to critique the leadership, right? But then, you cannot exist without critique, right? And Edward was always fond of saying criticism before solidarity. So on this, he failed many a time during his lifetime, but nevertheless, he moved. He adopted this because there was a consensus among Palestinians in view of the Palestinian uprising that there might be a solution worth having. But then he was the first to reject that idea when Oslo came about. And he dubbed it as the Palestinian Versailles. Right? So the point I'm making is Edward didn't stay in one place. His understanding of critique, which uses a musical issue of being contrapuntal, is central to understanding where his politics are. He never stays stable, right? He's always moving, always making a contrapuntal move. So for Edward, then, Palestine became a challenge. Right? And at the end of his life, he insisted that we must have coexistence and no exclusivism. He wrote an interesting essay in 91 or 92, which he never published. I was able to have it published with the family's permission in Jewish Currents. Peter Beinert had the editor annotate the article. It was an open letter to Jewish intellectuals. Right? And in this open letter to Jewish intellectuals, he was advised by his friends, Iqbal Ahmad and Masao Miyoshi and Gene Stein, that it was too harsh. He shouldn't publish it. I was 15 years younger than that crowd, right? And I'm the only one who supported it. And I think probably in retrospect, had Edward remained alive, he would probably share that perspective, because not publishing it didn't mean that the attacks against him stopped. In fact, the attacks against him increased, not only against him, but Palestinians writ large, right? And especially in the city of New York. So the end result is, what's the time?
It's 12:30.
Okay, so I should probably, all right. So the end result for Said is he insists on coexistence. He insists that we must have creative forms of struggle, right? And here he harks upon Iqbal's understanding of militants, right? He's not against armed struggle, but the question is, it's a right. It's a right that all peoples, occupied peoples have. The question is, what type of struggle do you conduct to weaken the resolve of your adversary? That is the standard. And I think that standard remains today more important than it was in the 60s, when the Palestinian movement claimed that they were engaged in armed struggle. In the long run, then, I think when you look at Said's life, Said was respected precisely because he reached a certain moral level of a moral level in public among Palestinians, and his enemies hated him, right? They tried to destroy him. They tried to ransack his office at Columbia. They tried to get the university to fire him after he had he made a decision while visiting South Lebanon with Fawaz Trabulsi and Ilyas Khouri, and threw a rock in the direction of a border. So all hell broke loose. You know, he kind of was apologetic. You know, I think he was wrong to be apologetic. That was the right thing to do. Once, after 20 years, the Israelis are being moved out of South Lebanon, it is time to celebrate and not to be apologetic. All right? But nevertheless, Edward is much more important than my little observations. And let me leave it at that. Just, open it up to see what your interests are. This book took me a while to finish because I got sick in the process. I lost 3 years. I will not regain a single minute of those years, but I managed to kind of get rid of the brain fog, etc., and managed to finish it. And I've managed to stand here in front of you, and in Amherst, and at Harvard, and Berkeley coming later next. So I'm happy that I'm able to do this. I'm more happy to see young friends, old friends, colleague that I respect and admire, and of course the younger students here. I appreciate your presence. Thank you.
Want to sit down or do you want to take questions? Yeah, I know. Let's sit down. Yeah, that was great. I'm going to pose the first question, and then I'm going to open it up to everyone else. I think a lot of students don't know but the theme that you talked about in your remarks this afternoon about how Edward broke from the reigning Arab nationalist sort of view on the question of Israel-Palestine and recognized the Jewish claims to that piece of land. And Edward coined the term, we are the victims of the victims. And he understood, or he said that we should understand the question of Palestine as not separate from Jewish history, but deeply connected. That this is an ongoing sort of story that binds these two narratives together. And I think that's why he had appealed in reaching slowly but surely a broad American audience, in particular American Jewish audience, because there was a sensitivity to the history of persecution, but also he wasn't willing to sort of back out in terms of what was done to the Palestinians in his famous essay that you referred to in the question of Palestine, Zionism from the standpoint of the victims. So could you say more about how Edwards was able to connect these two histories, the history of Jewish suffering, persecution, what happened in World War II, and its connection to the plight and the question of Palestine?
I think when Edward looks at the situation, number one, he doesn't see this typical colonial model as a useful one, although there is a colonial model, mind.
Mhm.
The French model well, when the French are defeated in Algeria, they can leave. That's not an option available in Palestine. Just so thinking of that, so he felt inexorably that the Jewish and Palestinian histories are intertwined. Clearly, for now, one is dominating and abusive, and the other is a victim. But he never veered away of this. And I think in that sense, his argument in Arabic and in English was a difficult one because in Arabic, get used to the non-nationalist understanding, right? And in the West, Said's view was difficult to take, I think, because Palestinians are not recognized. So the Palestinians are not recognized to begin with.
Right.
It's a long time. So they get recognized because they're being massacred. Genocide is being committed against them. I mean, that's not exactly a very salutary development, right? At least not in the immediate. But his approach, though, helped shape the discourses in the humanities. Sometimes a bit too much. I mean, some of the students started stop reading literature. He told them, boys and girls. I mean, our job is to read literature and then to write about literary critique. They were too much interested in deconstruction and things that. And more than that, in the same way, he kind of departs from some of the associations he had. Right? I mean, he introduces Foucault to the English reader in a lot of his writings, right? But then he moves away from Foucault because Foucault doesn't have a view, at least from Said's perspective, an understanding of resistance, such as are too dominant, etc. So, look, Edwards' role had shaped modern discourse. Now, it's much better today among at least intellectuals. Among power, we have zero. It's a bloody shame, especially the climate that we have. Not too far from you. You know what I'm talking about.
Strong.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question, one more question, and I'll open up to the audience. I have many questions. Since your book is about Edward Said as an oppositional intellectual, how would Edward respond to this particular moment that we're seeing in the Middle East with another war? Because it recalls the 2003 Iraq War. It also recalls the first Gulf War, where you sort of have compelling moral imperatives. On the one side, you see U.S. empire once again projecting itself in the region with its destructive force and all that sort of goes with it and that we've seen. But on the other side, you also have these despotic regimes within the region Saddam Hussein, and then the Islamic Republic with its, grotesque human rights record. And you have to sort of balance these competing moral claims, not trying to sort of ignore one or fall into the trap of the other, like these native informants have done. And so this is, I think, what Edward was, I think, very good at doing, is sort of keeping sight of both of these moral imperatives and speaking, honestly and courageously at particular compelling moments such as this. Since you studied his intellectual body of work and you knew him personally, could you give us some insight in terms of how Edward navigated these moments such as this?
He writes about it, and I reconstruct his argument on the Gulf Wars. And he was very much against American intervention overseas. This does not mean that he is for Saddam. Not at all. If anything, Saddam killed our friends. And to many of them. I remember on the eve of the second one, I had a dinner at my home, still in New York, or moving to New Jersey. And I had Edward, who was there, and Shafir Harout, and my friend Adnan, because he just passed away. And we were talking, and Shafir Harout was trying to convince us, hey, if you believe that you should be against war, go join the Kuwaitis that pay a lot of money. And we told them that we're against both sides. We're against, we want a non-interventionist as opposed to an interventionist. But clearly our voice was not effective. But that's why he stood. He understood that you can't support such wars. That such wars continue to destroy the lives of people. When you look at those wars and the human cost they have as a result of Gulf wars, now, Palestine, all of these situations, we have millions of casualties over a generation. That's incredible, right? It's too much. So I think he was clear. He would be against this war, obviously. He would be against the war against Iran. I dislike the regime of Iran, and I actually edited a book on Iran, very much influenced by some of my Iranian interlocutors, like Yervat Abrahamian. But interventions have always produced chaos rather than order. We've seen that in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. So why try it another place? Just doesn't make sense to me. Right? Imperial hubris. And of course, it's a clown in Washington. I mean, he was against going to war just a few weeks ago, and now he's in war. Bloody hell.
Yeah. Okay, the floor is open. Comments, questions?
Can I just
Go ahead.
ask a question? I think Edward would have been against it, not just because interventions produce chaos and a lot of disorder. I think you would have seen through the agendas of this. I mean, that's the point. We're not meant to really stand against these oppressive regimes. They had a totally different agenda. That's why the produce chaos and all that. I think Edward would have been clear about that. No?
Look, I mean, Edward didn't like any of these regimes. He had a column that he used to write. So he funded, I don't remember the name of the newspaper, but he stopped writing as the Gulf War was about to start. He could say the speech he wants. Now, the editor was a very interesting guy. He wrote a very lovely letter, hoping that sometime the Arab world will regain its sanity and he could return writing to his. But yes, Edward understood that. I think none of these regimes were his cup of tea, and he found them objection. He refused to get prices from Saudi Arabia states, some others have accepted. I think he maintained his independence of those regimes. He did not need them, and these regimes are major contributors to the current modernist movement.
Would you? So Edward was criticized when he was alive because he didn't condemn the human rights records of many of these states in the Arab world. Although he certainly didn't apologize for it, as you said.
He did.
But would you agree with the following observation that Edward's primary audience was a Western audience, an American audience? He wrote for that community. He was educated in the United States. His major works really had that audience in mind, not the audience within the Middle East. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. At a certain point, Edward gave up on the West. This is when he gravitates to writing in various outlets. He was writing in the Bahrain Weekly. The same column appeared in the País in Spain. And he wrote in some English outlet. In other words, he had given up on the American media establishment. He was tired of it. He didn't think it was worth his effort to engage. That's the last few years of his life. He also wrote to an audience in the Arab world because he wanted to communicate with them. Right? And I think they started knowing him better since he started those columns. Right? He wrote for a while in Hayat and then in some other newspaper, I don't remember that. And those were important because he was able to be read in Arabic without the translation, because we have a previous translation problem of his book, Orientalism, which is probably the worst translation ever by one of the top comparative literature people at Oxford. Right? It was a horrible translation, turgid, unreadable. If you read his Orientalism in Arabic, you didn't read it. It's not a book that's readable.
Was it translated again? Or is that the only?
Well, there's a translation in Egypt, bit better, not much. And of course, that book just generated all sorts of things like Edward's being safe in Islam and Edward and what and what. It did not receive a good reception in Arabic because the problem of translation. How do ideas, Edward writes about that, traveling theory, right? How do ideas travel? Right? But they travel through words, through communicative skills. So, but I think his choice of appearing to an Arab audience in the newspapers was a good one, right? Because he felt that they are his primary audience, not the Americans. 10 years before, he was writing mostly to an American. And he shifted.
Yes, good.
So maybe just following up on the translation question also. So you mentioned before some work has not been translated at all, right? And so is there a pattern to what got translated and what didn't? And was that his choice at some level, or? Yeah.
He chose the translator of Orientals. I'm intimately knowledgeable of this because I was one of the people working in that publishing house in Beirut. That was founded by Hani Hindi and Hakan Berwaza and me, literally. And I got the rights from Edward, and he insisted by being in Beirut when he would sign the contract. And he insisted on the translator. We had in mind somebody from AUB. Would have been much better, I think. Would have made it into a readable Arabic. Now, and we got a lot of funds to support the translation. So it's not just the lack of funds. all of Arabic translations are poorly done because they're kind of fly-by-night operation. This was not a fly-by-night. This was someone who believed that the translator is equal to the author. Well, yes, the translator could be an author, but they're not equal to the author of the intended book. So, other works, translated by Hovespian translated things with permission, and his translation was beautiful and useful. But not all of his books have been translated. Cultural Imperialism has been translated. Question of Palestine now, but that's another has been translated. A lot of his literary articles in the literature and what have you probably might have never been translated. But a lot more of his work has been translated since he passed away than during his life. Yes.
Hi, my question is on the responsibility of the intellectual and independence from institutions. Is intellectuals' dependence or independence possible or even desirable?
See, I mean, the responsibility of the intellectual is to work in tandem with the social movements whose job is to create change. And I think in some ways, by not adopting the Quaker notion of speaking truth to power, but rather addressing truth to those who are working in changing the equation, was something that made sense to me at least. Right. So I don't idealize the intellectual. It just serves Edward respects the most. It's Gramsci. Gramsci died in prison. Tortured by the fascists. So it's not the intellectual as a separate category. You are central to movements. And that's how he's done. He's not the type of person, Edward Said, who could be organized. He was not an organization man. Whatever he did, even when he joined the Palestine National Council, he did it as an act of solidarity. He would go there, attend for a half a day, and leave. Right? That's not what he was good at. That's not what he liked. He didn't have the temperament for the nitty-gritty of daily political involvements. But he could use his voice, his moral voice, to inform those who are struggling to make the change.
Okay, so I'm going to ask another question. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Nubar, for coming. You mentioned in your book and also in your talk the idea of weakening the resolve of the enemy. Today we stand in the light of genocide and in light of a society that polling shows continues to support the genocide. And so in the face of that, how do you think that relates to the idea of weakening the resolve of the enemy? If the opposition commits genocide and support for genocide endures, then how can you possibly, or where are the areas that you can conceptualize of weakening that resolve?
I have no answer, to be honest. It's a dire situation. My friend Ilan Pape and I appeared on a program that was anchored in Nazareth. And he and I were the guests. And he claimed that in 10 years, Israel would be defeated. But I told him, I love you, Ilan, but I think you're dead wrong. Not because I wish you dead wrong, I just don't see it. Right. So that's where I am. I'm a bit skeptical of any such claims. Now, the issue of how you deal with your adversary is central in any form of resistance. Because ultimately, the guns will stop and you will have to construct life afterwards. So you must prepare for that stage. For now, there is no such preparation. The Israelis are trying to eliminate you en masse. So I don't see hope right now. Which is kind of sad because we used to say 10, 20, 30 years. Well, my 10, 20, 30 years are up and I'm closer to my end than ever before, right? So I'm not optimistic. But at some point, it's like in the Gramscian sense, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of somewhere, somehow, that will come. But when, how, I am not sure. Yes.
On the question of the Jews and the connection to Palestine, it is true that the Jews have a historical memory in Palestine, and Palestine was always open to the Jews. And very, very small number came, and they came to Jerusalem mainly and to the religious areas. They did not think about it as a place where you could establish a state. It was only after Zionism, and this is really the break in Jewish history in relation to Palestine, is Zionism, as it came in Europe. So obviously, that has to be clarified, that historical memory does not entitle you to come and, push the people who are living there. Because now there is a kind of, an attempt to, because the Palestinians started talking about being indigenous and all that stuff, there is an attempt now in Israel to indigenize the Jews, that we are the indigenous population now, among especially the right wing.
The answer to that is Avi Shlein's answer.
Sorry?
Avi Shlein's answer is an interesting one. He sees himself as a Palestinian Jew. That's an interesting answer.
Yeah, he's right. Iraqi Jew, actually. But
he's a Palestinian Jew.
Yeah.
Who lives in England.
Yeah, because they went to other countries, the Jews. The ones who, came to Palestine came by force, actually. After World War II, they were not allowed to come here, and from Russia and from the Arab countries. They did not come voluntarily to I think this should be, clear. I don't remember exactly how really Edward, I read his book on the question of Palestine, right, the Palestine question, but I can't remember how he exactly, formulated it. But I think, it's very important that we think about it that way, or at least people think about
it. Look, actually, you cannot, you have to take into account that the objective of the modern Zionist movement was to transform the native population into a minority at best, if not complete expulsion. What do you do now and 10 years from now? Do Palestinians have your choice of struggling in the way that the Algerians struggle, let's say, that the adversary will leave? I don't think that's an option. But the question becomes, can there be an understanding and a political understanding where domination has to be excluded from the equation in order to allow for equality among the multiple segments of population in Palestine, whether they are Palestinian or not Israeli, because that Israeli national.
Yeah, so just to put a sharper point on what you just said, in one of Edward Said's interviews, he says that, look, we are people who experience expulsion. We don't want to expel another people. who are living on a piece of land. What we want is what you just said. We want a formula where we can live in equality, whether that's a secular national state or two
without
states.
any subordination.
Without any subordination, right?
That's, and he repeats it often and often and often. And he makes that point in multiple ways
Yeah.
in his interviews with Haaretz, in his talk in front of a Jewish audience. And he's clear on that.
Yeah, and that's precisely what the Israeli government has always rejected.
Yeah.
The principle of equality.
Of course.
And the United States backs them on that. But that's why I think what Edward was so brilliant at is articulating that claim that what we want is equality. We can't turn back the clock, but we want a solution that everyone can live together from the river to the sea in equality, regardless of religion or ethnicity. That was really his core
I
claim.
don't think Edward would imagine Palestine today go back to the 1947 status quo.
Right.
I think, right? I think so. In view of that, is well, on the same piece of land, a modality has to be constructed for multiple peoples to live in equality and mutual respect. That's clearly far in future. Genocide taking place like now, you can't imagine anybody in Israel, with the exception of Ilan Pape and 5 other people, who
Gideon Levy. Gideon Levy.
Gideon Levy is what a wonderful, one of the most honest people.
So that you for that.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you said earlier about intellectuals and how they should work with social movements. And I never met Edward, but I saw him at a protest in New York City during the Second Intifada. It was organized by a group called Alaga New York and other organizations based in New York. So I wonder if you could speak to how his own ideas about Palestine were informed. I mean, was he engaging with these groups, and how, they invited him to come speak, and it was for me, a very different way to see him. Right, at this protest, I think it was in that square near NYU, the name of which I'm forgetting right now. Washington Square Park. Washington Square Park. And then you also mentioned his students earlier. So I'm just wondering how was he an intellectual that was engaging with social movements? He was engaging clearly in the process with the Palestinian leadership for a while. But I wonder, in his time in New York with students and student groups, how were his ideas?
Look, Edward was not the organizer, one can conjure. But he did spend time to think about what can be done. So, for example, first Intifada started, and there was the possibility that some political move would be made. He asked me to organize a group from Palestine, from various parts, whether it was Faisal Husseini or Hanan Ashrawi, a few others. And of course, Arafat sent this chef de cabinet and Nabil Shaf. The whole idea was to see, inform that there are forms of resistance that must be adopted. And he had just come back from South Africa, and he brought in the ambassador of the ANC to inform them about the type of struggle that they conducted. And the participants there did not understand Edward's reasoning why he was doing it. Well, because it's about politics, it's about mobilization. And the more there was an intifada, the more Palestinians were demobilized internationally. That's incredible. When you have the first intifada is a very salutary development in modern Palestinian history. And during that time, Palestinians elsewhere are totally demobilized. In Gaza, Hamas thought that the West Bank would be up in flames because they have the wrong theory. They're still thinking the folklore theory notion that, that we can do it. Well, no, the West Bank is controlled by a leadership that is afraid of its people, that does not want any to rock the boat. So you're not going to have that with the West. And it's the heavens that anything in support of that it's there. So the point is, he would participate in attempts to see what is it that can be done. He's not the organizer. He's not going to lead the organization. Simply thinking out of the box, trying to come up with solutions by bringing Palestinian compatriots together. Part of the problem that we saw is geography is our enemy. We're divided, separated. Geography is my enemy. All these fine people here that I haven't seen in years is because I haven't been able to travel to DC in years, right? So geography is our enemy in many ways. So that's what I would say. But don't look at him as the organizer, but look at him as the facilitator of trying to come up with ideas that hopefully will be adopted politically by those who are engaged actively in it.
I think, he was also, it's very important, this organization kind of really is totally forgotten now, but it was very important. The AAUG, the Arab American University graduates, this is where he was working with Ibrahim Lord and Taysir Arouri. It was a very active, group.
See, these types of organizations lost steam after, right? I mean, AUG doesn't exist.
Yeah,
right.
But it had
new forms.
It was the first kind of really,
sure. But still, even in AUG, right? What Edward contributed to AUG was he brought the funding, and he was the editor of the first issue or two of the journal, Arab Studies book. Right? He was able to do that because people were complaining that we can't publish anywhere. He said, "Fine, let's create our own publication." The Arab Studies book. And it lasted for a while. I think it might still appear. I don't know, does it?
It does.
Yeah, I think but he's very old now.
So that type of
they have the journal, they still have the journal.
Would you agree that Edward was a big picture thinker, right? He wasn't someone who was an activist on the local level.
But yes and no. On the things he had passionately about, he worked individually to identify musical talent, pair them with wealthy Palestinians to fund their education, whether it's at Juilliard or in London, whatever the school is in London, the equivalent of Juilliard, because he had a passion for it, right? And he did. Many young Palestinian, classical musicians got their start because Edward put them together with funders who could support their training. So that's a nitty-gritty thing, but it's not an organizing of a political movement. Political movements, it's not, he didn't see himself as an organizer of political movement. And I think it would be mistaken to attribute that.
Yeah. So one last question for you about Edward and his connection to the struggle for justice in Palestine. Edward sort of foresaw the coming collapse of the Palestinian national movement under Arafat. In the last 10 years of his life, all of the essays that he wrote were really a strong critique of Arafat's capitulation at the Oslo peace deal. And what we see right now was sort of what Edward sort of predicted. You have the Palestine National Movement, which was once a national liberation organization, turning into effectively a collaborating class for the Israelis to control the Palestinians. And the Israelis were open about this. And, the Arafat's men who came back to the West Bank effectively became a collaborationist class for perks and privileges. And that's a sad commentary on the state of the Palestinian national movement, which at one time had this global resonance around the global south as a major national liberation organization. Now it's effectively dead.
See, an interesting point that when Arafat was still outside, a lot of people were trying to tell him, please do not go to Gaza and become the mayor of Gaza. Stay outside and represent the unity of Palestinian people. And people, Edward did that. Maurice Maqsood actually wrote a whole piece in the Nahar, open letter to Arafat, telling him, please don't go to Gaza. And I think it was a brilliant piece that released. Because essentially what the Palestinian movement did through after Oslo is to completely demobilize Palestinian. Therefore, people felt marginalized. Therefore, forms of kind of liberal dependencies were created throughout the West Bank and to some extent that contributed and consolidated the demobilization.
I mean, so I know the last chapter of your book speaks about that, chapter 5, right? The whole question of Palestinian national movement, what happened to it, and what Edward.
I see it as the Palestinian national movement imploded in us.
Yeah.
You know, when the fight between Fatah and this, it was never like this. Now, can it re-emerge? At some point, some reconfiguration will emerge to represent the interests of the Palestinians. What, when, and where, I have absolutely no idea. Because right now it's just like a desert. It's empty. There is no organizing place. There is more trauma than anything else.
Final question or comment before we wrap up?
You know, about Oslo, kind of, I know we always give, you know, I mean, because intellectuals like this kind of halo and influence, which we really don't have actually in society. You know, I mean, Salah or Messi or whatever have more influence than all the intellectuals on the masses, right? But in any case, I think we always give credit to Saeed of being the first to speak out against Oslo, and he did, of course. But actually,
I don't, because I knew a lot of people who were opposed.
But the first one who really spoke about it, and very analytically and very well, is Haidar Abdel-Shafi, who was, you know, here the head of the delegation in Washington. And he never is mentioned, you know, when we talk about Oslo, Haidar. But we should really reevaluate and look at it as a movement.
See, Haidar,
he was much, I mean, you said,
Saeed doctor and Gaza, he essentially withdrew from the negotiations. He said it's a dead end, and he told Arafat what you're doing is contrary to the interests of the Palestinian people, right? So in that sense, you know, you have him a major figure in Palestinian history. You know, he comes from a left tradition.
That's what I'm saying.
So of course there are people. I mean, look, to identify Edward as the one horseman. Edward wrote, Haidar did what he could as a political leader, as a respected elder of his society. He was, you know, irrespective of people's ideological viewpoints. Haidar was revered as.
Yeah, I mean, he has an interview actually in the Journal of Palestine Studies about immediately after Oslo. And, you know, it's very, very perceptive until now if you look at it. But I think, you know.
And I think, look, there are people who started thinking of Oslo as a possibility. And then they changed their mind. You know, they saw what it was. To his credit, Edward did not budge. He was against it on day one. And, you know, he, at that time, there was no cell phones and internet. I had gone somewhere for 2 days, and I had written my viewpoint in an article in Newsday. So he was hoping that I would take the right decision, right? He was leaving me messages on the phone, so I called back, said, okay, he was a thumb, and he was, I'm following the right path as a for the straight path. So, yeah, I think a lot of people of different walks of life, Edward as a symbol. Edward was not only a person, but a symbol. He was bigger than just individuals. He was bigger than other Palestinians, and it's not to denigrate any. Haidar, in historical terms, a major figure in Palestinian history, right? And you cannot ignore it. And I know when I went to Gaza with Edward, who hosted Edward? Haidar Shafi. So it makes a lot of sense. But there are a lot of good Palestinian impeccable records, but they are not the ones who are running the affairs. Palestinian life, unfortunately.
Nubar, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
You really put your heart and soul into this book, and it shows. Reading through it, you say in the beginning, you have this wonderful line that's about Edward. That he was gregarious and told many stories. And then you say, we conspired for justice together. I think that's a really wonderful sort of encapsulation of both your life's work and Edward's. So thank you very much for the book. Thank you for being here. Please join me in